Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, senior editor Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.
We're sitting here less than 24 hours from a historic, unprecedented moment. Former President Donald Trump was convicted on all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Can you talk to us about the impact of this verdict?
Well, the obvious impact is that now somebody who might become the next president of the United States is going to be a convicted felon. The political impact at this point is still unclear. Elections are close affairs, and this is the sort of moment that people who might otherwise be sort of tuning out the news of the day might turn their heads and say, "Whoa!" And this is really a big deal. And although the vast majority of voters are not going to be impacted by this, or frankly anything else that could come between now and November when everybody goes to the polls, there are still some people who might be swayed. And if you have a slight movement, that could determine who's the next president. But we don't know. It's far too soon to even see the polls, let alone whether people are thinking about this several months from now. We won't know exactly how this has affected things until mid-November once we have seen the election results.
Definitely. I mean, we still have 5 months till the presidential election, so this will be baked in by then, and many things can happen. But you wrote a piece for Forbes while the jury was deliberating, and it was, "Trump can be a micromanager. This may lead to his conviction." First, can you explain how he has the potential to be a micromanager, and can you talk about if you thought that impacted the verdict at all?
Yeah, so Trump is a man of contradictions. And one of the ways in which you see that is how he manages people. So there are certain things that he doesn't get into the details much at all. He reportedly didn't want to read the president's daily brief when he was serving in the Oval Office, which is sort of the dense text that all presidents read to understand the national security concerns every single day. He seemed to prefer bullet points and images and that sort of thing. But at the same time, he does really hone in on certain things, and he's always been this way. So he might get obsessed with what the shade of a paint color is that he's painting a building, or he might get obsessed with, for example, his checkbook, every penny that leaves his personal account. He said for a long time, although he runs a large business, that he wants to be the person signing the checks. If you look through real estate documents, his name is the one that's at the bottom of those documents that he has signed, which is not unheard of, but isn't what every real estate developer of his magnitude does. And so he does like to be involved in certain details, although he doesn't necessarily get involved in all of the details. And that was key in this case, because this case was largely a question of, did Donald Trump know about the falsification of these business records, and did he cause the falsification of those business records? Or would he be able to say, no, it was the fault of the people in the accounts payable department, or no, it was the fault of my former lawyer, Michael Cohen, or no, it was the fault of my kids and an executive who I had entrusted my business to while I was in the White House. Ultimately, the jury decided, no, Donald Trump caused this, and therefore convicted him on all 34 counts.
I want to talk about the personal impact to Donald Trump just a little bit. As we know now, he is a convicted felon. I want to talk about how this impacts his bank account, because he faced a cash crunch months ago due to owing millions in his civil fraud case. What does this do to his net worth?
Virtually nothing. Donald Trump is not footing his own legal expenses right now. That's coming in through, mom and pop campaign donors all over the country who are supporting his political efforts, and then those political operations are in turn paying his lawyers. The amount of money involved in this case was shockingly small. Remember, this boils down to an $130,000 payment from a guy worth billions of dollars. For all of the gravity and magnitude of this decision, it's amazing that it took so little, a transaction with so little money involved, to yield the first criminal convictions of a former president of the United States. The financial impact of this case is much less significant than the financial impact of the civil fraud case that he was on trial for last fall, and ultimately in which a decision was made against him early this year, fining him more than $450 million.
So let's talk about what's next. Sentencing is July 11th, right before the RNC. His team has indicated that they will appeal. So, how is this process going to play out, especially with a presidential election as the backdrop?
There's no precedent. Nobody knows. I mean, we don't know what all of the political ramifications are. When the appeals process plays out, okay, so what happens if he loses his appeal and is sentenced, but is simultaneously the sitting president of the United States? We don't know. If he does go to jail, we know that the Secret Service is required to go with him. But look, the legal system takes a long time. Remember, this stems back to a conspiracy that began in 2015, payments that happened in 2016, and here we are in 2024. Although the world has known the facts of this case, most of them for 8 years, we're just finally now seeing a conviction on it, and the appeals process will similarly take a long time. And so ultimately, uh, the justice system will arrive at its decision, the judge will impose a sentence, and Donald Trump will have to abide by whatever those consequences are. But that could be a few months from now, it could be a few years from now. We just don't know at this point.
Something that's really interesting that right before you and I were talking, the Trump campaign reportedly says it raised $34.8 million in small donor funds since the conviction. So are you surprised by that number? Are you surprised by Trump's response? Has anything here, because you cover Trump, his business dealings, his legal challenges so intimately, anything surprise you?
The amount of money coming into the coffers of his campaign is not surprising. Donald Trump is a person who has dominated the headlines now for running up on a decade. However, there are still moments where he dominates them more than he does others. And in those moments, you tend to see the people who are most committed to him rally around him. So that could be when he is indicted, it could be upon a conviction. When, for example, Truth Social's parent company went public and there was all this chatter about that, a lot of his supporters rushed into that and bought up shares. So people get excited in certain moments and decide, you know what, I want to put my money with this guy, whether it's a donation or investment or whatever. And I think that that's what you saw yesterday. There was for a while when Red, the donating platform for the Republican side, was having connectivity issues online, suggesting that there may have been a surge of traffic. So it's not surprising that they, are reporting large amounts of donations coming in. I think that the bigger question is whether that sort of surge how much longevity that will have. Will this be something that people continue to commit to over the ensuing months, or will, like so many stories, even major stories before this, will it sort of peter out and people will stop donating as much once the headlines aren't so blaring?
Hearing that number, $34.8 million reportedly, also paired with controversy, Trump in the headlines has been good for Trump politically in the past. Do you think that in any way, him becoming a convicted felon, him saying, hey, the system is rigged, do you think this plays politically well for him?
It's hard to know, but remember, there are two different parts of U.S. elections. You have primaries and you have the general election. And in a primary where you're going to be, voted on by fellow Republicans, you could see it helping him, but he's already won the primary, so it doesn't actually matter. If you were in a close race for a primary, you might see, oh, his base is more consolidated and therefore is more fervently behind him, and that's going to help. But he locked up the primary long ago, so that doesn't really work there. And then in the general election, you're much more appealing to a broad group of people, and so I think what it's going to do is sort of crystallize the feelings that people already had about Donald Trump. And so if they felt like he was aggrieved and like he needed them in their corner and he needed all the support that he could get, they're probably going to feel that even more. If they felt like he was a criminal who, had bashed through all these norms, they're now going to say, look, see, now he is a convicted criminal and it's just as we thought. So I think it's more likely to sort of solidify people's opinions. And as I said earlier, the big question is whether it sways even 0.5%, 1%, of that very small group of people who still might be up for grabs.
He faces an additional 54 felony charges in his 3 remaining criminal cases. So, Dan, what are you watching out for next?
Well, I don't think that any of those cases are likely to happen before the election, but obviously the political consequences is something that we are going to get some information on relatively soon. Once polls start coming out, you can see whether this had any impact. And that'll be one thing to look for. Then as you move, closer to the actual election day, I think you start to say, okay, is this something that has legs? Are people still talking about the fact that he was convicted, or like so many stories, is it sort of get washed away? I mean, think of all of the controversies that seem like, wow, this is an earth-shattering moment over the last 8 years with Donald Trump, and many of them simply people don't remember anymore, or if they do, they just sort of bake it in. And so, I think how long this is a dominating part of the conversation will be interesting to see. And then, of course, if he's elected, well, then we're in for more unprecedented moments. Okay, so there are 2 federal investigations. Are those going to be immediately shut down? If so, what's going to be the blowback from that? There's also another investigation in Georgia in which he's been indicted. And how does that play out? Does that go to trial while he's the sitting president? So there are all of these different things in play right now that we're just going to have to see what happens over the next few years. But there's going to be no shortage of things to look out for.
Something that you said that stuck out to me was we're in store for more unprecedented moments. And you also said, like, looking back at the past 8 years, I mean, there has been history-making moment with Donald Trump, with chaos and controversy. Because you've covered him so heavily the past years, does that work in his favor that he is creating so many unprecedented moments that the shock value is gone for a lot of Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's not just that the shock value is gone because they've seen controversy before. It's also that Donald Trump is a master at blunting controversy and making it into something that what would be death blows for every other politician in the world just sort of bounce off of him after a little while. Remember, this hush money case, comes from a payment and a reimbursement involved with that payment that came right on the heels of the Access Hollywood tape, which large parts of the Republican Party of the country thought was going to end Donald Trump's campaign. That was in October of 2016. And then the next month, he defeats Hillary Clinton and becomes the president. So that's just one instance in which Donald Trump's been able to move past this stuff. And as that's been happening, all of these different controversies, and he's stiff-armed one and another, he's also been very actively working to discredit the institutions that most people look to as neutral arbiters of what's going on. So at one point that was the press and certainly the justice system. And Donald Trump, even before he was convicted here, said, even Mother Teresa would get convicted based on these instructions. And that's a very clear sign of sort of the master at work, saying, I'm delegitimizing this process before we even know the results of this process as an insurance policy for if the verdict goes the wrong way, as it did for him.
And after the verdict, there were memes floating around on social media with Trump and Jesus, Trump and Mother Teresa. So that messaging has been going around since the verdict. Dan Alexander, per usual, thank you for the conversation.
Sure thing. Thank you.